Now let's look at your macronutrients. Remember that your macronutrients include your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your lipids. Let's begin with your carbohydrates. Carbohydrates make up about 45 to 65% of your food intake. A complex carbohydrate is going to be a polysaccharide, whereas a simple carbohydrate will be a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. A polysaccharide would be such as starch, and a simple sugar would be something like table sugar or sucrose. The glycemic index of a carbohydrate tells an individual how quickly that carbohydrate will be digested in the small intestine and absorbed into the blood. In other words, what its effect will be on your blood glucose levels. The higher the glycemic index, the faster your blood glucose levels will rise. A carbohydrate that has a glycemic index of less than 55 is considered to have a low glycemic index and therefore will increase your blood glucose levels at a slower rate than a carbohydrate that has a glycemic index of 70 or higher. That's considered a high glycemic index, and these carbohydrates will tend to make your glucose levels rise quickly. This slide here just illustrates some of the foods that have a low glycemic index and some that have a high glycemic index. Not all carbohydrates are created equal. Some carbohydrates are harmful to you. Let's look at high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is found primarily in processed foods. So why does industry use high fructose corn syrup? Industry discovered long ago that high fructose corn syrup is sweeter than table sugar or sucrose, and therefore you don't have to use as much of it to sweeten a product. If you don't have to use as much of the carbohydrate, then your packaging can be smaller and you can save money. So what is it? Table sugar actually consists of a fructose molecule bonded to a glucose molecule in a 50-50 ratio, so 50% fructose to 50% glucose. High fructose corn syrup, on the other hand, consists of 55% fructose to 45% glucose. And these two molecules are not bonded to one another, chemically bonded to each other. What this means is when you ingest the high fructose corn syrup and it gets into your small intestine, you don't have to chemically break it down. So it's absorbed very quickly into your blood. It's transported to the liver by way of the hepatic portal vein, and the liver then converts that fructose into triglycerides. If you consume enough of high fructose corn syrup, this can lead to fatty liver disease. About 70 million people have this, and this in turn can lead to metabolic disorders such as obesity and type 2 diabetes mellitus. Some beneficial carbohydrates include those that are insoluble or cannot be digested by your enzymes. You don't have the enzymes to digest them, and so they become roughage or bulk. One example is pectin, and you find pectin in many fruits, apples, citrus fruits. Pectin is very good for you. It lowers the LDLs, or the low density lipoproteins. These are the bad cholesterol lipoproteins. So you should eat an apple or a fruit a day. It does help keep the doctor away. Recall from AP1 that there are 3 different types of lipids. Triglycerides, which are your fats and your oils. Steroids, which are made from cholesterol. And phospholipids, which are found within the membranes of your cells. We're going to begin by looking at the triglycerides. This slide illustrates the structure of a triglyceride molecule. It consists of a glycerol molecule that's been bonded to 3 fatty acid molecules by dehydration synthesis. This slide illustrates the difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat. At the top of the slide, you'll see a triglyceride with the glycerol and the 3 fatty acids. If you move down to the bottom, on the left, you'll see a saturated fatty acid. In between the carbons in that fatty acid, the C's, you'll notice that you have a single line between each carbon. These single lines represent single covalent bonds. These are very strong chemical bonds between the carbons. If you look at the unsaturated, you'll notice the red circle is around 2 carbons that have 2 lines there, and this is a double covalent bond. If a fatty acid has a double covalent bond, then it will be unsaturated, meaning that you could add additional hydrogens to those carbons. If you have multiple double covalent bonds in your fatty acid, then it is a polyunsaturated fat. Unsaturated fats tend to come from plants and are liquid at room temperature. Saturated fats tend to come from animals and are solid at room temperature. However, there are exceptions. Hydrogenated fats are fats that have had hydrogens attached to carbons within the fatty acids. So if you have a polyunsaturated fat, you'll notice up at the top you've got some carbons with double covalent bonds. So these are going to be typically a liquid at room temperature. Let's say you want to turn that into a solid. You can add hydrogens to those carbons that have the double covalent bonds. That's called hydrogenation. And now you get rid of the double covalent bonds and you have all single covalent bonds. And you can see in red down at the bottom the hydrogens that have been added. So you're turning a polyunsaturated fat into a hydrogenated fat because you added hydrogens to it. And this allowed you to take a liquid at room temperature and convert it into a solid, such as margarine. Hydrogenated fats are not healthy for you. That's what they've determined, and so you want to stay away from these. A second type of lipid is cholesterol. Remember, cholesterol is used to make your steroids. The majority of the cholesterol in your blood, about 85% of it, is synthesized by the liver. The liver uses carbohydrates and triglycerides to synthesize a molecule called acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA then in turn is used to make cholesterol. Because cholesterol is a lipid, it is hydrophobic and therefore can't be transported dissolved in the plasma. Instead, it has to be transported as a lipoprotein. A lipoprotein consists of the cholesterol and the triglycerides, which are both hydrophobic, the phospholipids, which are hydrophobic and hydrophilic, it has 2 separate ends, and proteins. You've heard of low-density lipoproteins and high-density lipoproteins. We're going to talk about what's the difference between these, and we're also going to include a third group, the very low-density lipoproteins. The higher the percentage of the lipid in the lipoprotein, the lower the density. And the opposite is true. The greater the proportion of proteins to lipids within the lipoprotein, the higher the density. There are 3 types of lipoproteins. The first type is the very low density lipoproteins, or the VLDLs. These have a high percentage of triglycerides and cholesterol. They are made by the liver. This is the way for the liver to package the triglycerides and transport the triglycerides to the adipocytes. So the VLDLs transport triglycerides to the adipocytes, unload the triglycerides there, the adipocytes take the triglycerides in, and once the VLDLs unload the triglycerides, they then become low-density lipoproteins. Low-density lipoproteins transport their cholesterol that's remaining in them to peripheral tissues that are expressing receptors for the LDLs. These are tissues that are going to need cholesterol to synthesize other molecules such as steroid hormones. The third type of cholesterol is what we call high-density lipoproteins or HDLs. These lipoproteins are synthesized by the liver. They are high-density lipoprotein envelopes that are released from the liver, which go to the tissues in the arterial walls, picking up cholesterol and returning it back to the liver. The liver then takes the cholesterol and incorporates it into the bile so that you can eliminate the cholesterol from the body. That's why HDLs are considered your good cholesterol, because they help eliminate cholesterol from the body. A third macronutrient are your proteins. Proteins are made from amino acids. Essential amino acids are amino acids that your body cannot synthesize, so you must include them in your diet. Complete proteins are proteins that contain the essential amino acids so that you can get all of the essential amino acids required when you eat them. Most complete proteins are going to be proteins from animal products, but not always. You can see the soybeans there at the end. Those are from plants. Incomplete proteins are proteins that lack the essential amino acids. They may have several of them, but they're not going to have all of them in that particular protein. And you can see that most of your incomplete proteins come from plant products. So if you are a vegan or a vegetarian, you can still get all of the essential amino acids that you need. You just have to be a little bit more creative and knowledgeable when you are preparing your meals. Remember that your genetic information, your DNA, carries the recipes to make the polypeptides or the proteins in your body. Proteins have many different functions. You've learned about transport proteins, plasma proteins, protein carriers, receptors, enzymes, structural proteins such as in your hair and your nails and your skin. So there are many different types of proteins with many different types of functions. Anabolic hormones are hormones that trigger protein synthesis. And these are some examples of anabolic hormones: growth hormone, thyroxine, and your sex hormones. Catabolic hormones, on the other hand, are going to be hormones that trigger the breakdown of proteins. And cortisol is an example of a catabolic hormone. Let's move on to micronutrients. Remember, these are nutrients that you need in small quantities, and these include your vitamins and your minerals. Know which one of your vitamins are fat soluble. These are vitamins A, D, E, and K, ADEC. These vitamins, when you absorb them, have to be carried in a micelle during the digestive and absorption process occurring in the small intestine. Vitamins can function as coenzyme precursors. Some enzymes require vitamins in order for them to be able to carry out their function. The minerals that I want you to pay attention to are the ones that we've already learned about. So you've learned about sodium and potassium in terms of action potentials, cardiac function. You've learned about the chloride shift with the bicarbonate ion in transporting carbon dioxide. And you've learned about calcium when it comes to the action potential and the neuromuscular junction, as well as muscle contraction. So the ones that we've talked about are the ones that I want you to go back to and try to remember what they're for. So I'm not going to throw out one that we haven't talked about.